So we take just a moment to move stuff around. Here, if you have your Bibles, we're going to be looking in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. Matthew, chapter 5. And we're on part 5 of our series, You Asked For It. So these are all sermon topics that were requested. And I'm hoping that today's interesting. I thought about it, and it's something that I have definitely struggled with over the years. But it is marshmallow Christians, or not being a marshmallow Christian. And so I'm interested in this. In fact, I brought my bag of marshmallows just to inspire me. No, I brought a bag of marshmallows. Seriously. So I was looking at these, and I was thinking about marshmallows. What's a description of a marshmallow? Soft, gooey, squishy. Any others? Sugary. How about nutritional value? Yeah, there's lots of calories, but on the nutritional side, very, very low. When you look at marshmallows, how many would use these for actually doing something productive? Would you really try to build a house out of a marshmallow? Is that the description you'd want? Would you really want to sit on a marshmallow? Kind of soft, kind of squishy. But I was thinking about this, and the real sermon title was, how do I not be a marshmallow Christian, or not being a marshmallow Christian? And it really raises a central question as to what kind of followers or what kind of disciples Jesus wanted. Did Jesus want his followers to be marshmallows, soft, sweet, spongy? Or did Jesus expect something else? And so we're going to look, because the primary passage that has been used to support this idea of marshmallow Christians comes in Matthew chapter 5. So let's look right there. This is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5. And we're going to look at verses 38 through 42. And as we get to these verses, I want you to understand what Jesus is doing here. He is preaching and teaching to the crowd gathered around him. And he has 6 points that he makes. And he starts every one with, "You have heard it said, but I say." And so he reminds them of the things that they have heard. And then he really challenges them to step up to the next level. To level up, to do something beyond what they've always just heard. And so when we read this, keep in mind this, "You have heard it said." You have heard that it was said, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you." Kind of sounds like become a marshmallow, doesn't it? And I have heard that, I've never heard a pastor say, you should be a marshmallow. But I have heard this passage used to support the idea that Christians should really be spineless, that they should have no courage, that they really shouldn't stand up for themselves, that they shouldn't stand up to injustice, that they really shouldn't do anything because it might offend somebody. It might cause a problem. And so as we look at this passage, I want you to keep in mind the context. Jesus has just said, "You have heard it said, do not commit murder. But I say, do not be angry. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I say, do not lust. You have heard it said, love your friend and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you." You see the difference here as we start to go through this. In fact, the passage on loving your enemy directly follows this. Now, what we need to understand is what Jesus was quoting. This is an old law. This is the Italian law. And it's also known in a more common phrase. In fact, I'm starting to see my kids live this out. It's tit for tat. Right? You did this, so I do that. And I'm watching it happen. You wouldn't think that Alex can pull this off yet, but he has. I watched him the other day. He did it. My parents were up watching my kids, and Jen and I escaped. And when I came back, Mom tells me the story. She's like, "Alex just screamed because Allie," and I couldn't figure out what was going on. He's screaming because Allie stole his toys. And he was getting her in trouble. She took his stuff. He was getting her in trouble. It's amazing. We're able to do this really, really well. Keep score of all of the wrongs that happen to us, and then make sure that others know about it. Has that ever happened? Once or no. You've never done that with your brother and I bet more than once. We are really good at this. And what amazes me is just like being angry, or just like lusting, or just like hating people who hurt us, no one has had to teach us to do that. No one has really had to teach us to keep score of the wrongs that happen to us, or the things that other people do that aren't right, that affect us or hurt us or put us down in some example. And so this law, this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, the very first part of it, it looks like it enables you to go extract somebody's eye when they take yours, right? Isn't that what it sounds like? They do something to you, it gives you the right to go and do this to them. But in fact, it was the beginning of mercy in the Old Testament. Because what it means is, if you take my eye, I can't take two of yours. Or if for some reason you would pull one tooth of mine, I can't leave you toothless. There's a big difference, right? And as this came about, it was an idea of don't do anything worse than what has been done to you. In fact, show some mercy. Don't plot revenge. Don't make them pay. They'll suffer the same thing that you did. It's really the beginning of mercy, as odd as that sounds. Now, what happened is that too many people were going around with one eye, right? Too many people were losing teeth. And so over the years, they softened this just a bit more. And there was actually a nice little fee schedule set up that if you poked someone's eye out, you had to pay a certain amount of money. And a tooth was worth a certain amount of money, and a limb was worth a certain amount of money. In fact, doesn't it sound kind of like personal injury lawyers? That's really what it was. If you did something wrong, it had been softened so much that if you did something wrong, they didn't really come and do the same thing to you. You had to go to court and pay the damages done. And so when Jesus steps up and he says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And he's saying, I give you something different. I am saying, step up and do something different. In fact, I'm saying, give up your right to collect the money. Give up your right to go sue. Instead of worrying about how much you're going to get out of it, instead of worrying about collecting the damages that have been done to you, we're going to let it go. Give up your right to get someone else back. Now, I want you to think about that. What does holding on to that right of getting someone back do to you? What does it do when you're thinking about revenge? It fosters some hate. How many of you sleep well when you're plotting revenge? One hand, and I'm not surprised. The reality is, for most of us, and this, myself included, when I'm thinking about the ways that I have been wronged, I get a little excited. In fact, it becomes a little bit hard to settle down, to go to sleep, because I'm going to get them back, and I don't want to forget all the things wrong. And then you start to make the mental list. And it's amazing how that list can grow, right? It starts out from one little wrong, and by the end, you have a good 10 or 15 things on that list of how they have wronged you. And what changes is that in us, is that the whole thing becomes about me. It becomes about me and my needs and the wrong things you have done. It leads us to become very selfish. It leads us to become very bitter. It leads us to become so focused on all the wrongs that we have endured, we're not really doing anything else positive, are we? In fact, it can dominate everything in our life. And so when Jesus is talking to all of his followers, everyone who has come out to listen to him preach and teach, he's saying, guys, you've got to stop worrying about all the little things that have been done to you. And you need to let it go. Because if you focus on this, you're going to miss so much more. It's going to lead you down a really, really bad road. Jesus challenges them to a higher standard. And there are some who think that this is the first time it's ever been said, but really, if you go back and look at Proverbs chapter 24, verse 29, you're going to find a really cool verse that I bet no one knows is there. It says, "Do not say, I will do to others as they have done to me. I will pay them back for what they have done." Old Testament says, do not try and pay someone back for the stuff they have done to you. This wasn't brand new material, and all of Jesus' followers probably would have known this, but it's easy to tune that out because it's much more fun to get someone back when they have hurt you. So that's what we look at here. And doesn't that sound like the beginnings of let's all become marshmallows? We're going to give up our rights. We're not going to do anything to stand up for ourselves. We're just going to, whoever does anything they want to us, we're just going to let that happen. But you couple this with the way Jesus lived. And that's the next part that I want to look at. What did Jesus actually do? How did he interact with people that he was around? Well, one of the first stories you're going to find in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, is Jesus going into the temple. And if you know this story, Jesus cleanses the temple. And the Gospel of John is the only gospel where Jesus makes a whip and drives everybody out. That is not marshmallow-like. I don't care how you phrase it. I don't care how you want to spin it. That is not a marshmallow. A marshmallow does not take a whip and drive people out of the temple. In fact, we read in there that Jesus flipped the tables, that he spilled out all the money, drove the cattle, the livestock, the birds, and the money changers out of the temple because what was going on in there was not appropriate. That is non-marshmallow behavior at its finest. And as I was thinking about that, he enters the tables and he puts an end to the money changers. But do you know what the money changers were doing in there? And not just changing money. They had quite the racket. They were very crooked. The way this would work is that if you were coming into worship, and we could actually set this up right out here, before you would enter into the building, we would have you sit down with the money changers, and the first thing you would have to do is decide what you were going to do for your offering that day, or your sacrifice so that you could worship God. And you would have to exchange the appropriate amount of money, U.S. currency, for Cornerstone dollars. So you would take your money and buy Cornerstone dollars. And because these money changers were very, very fair, they gave an even exchange rate, right? No, price gouging. Very, very poor exchange rate. And so you would lose money the moment you came in, because they weren't fair. And then they would tell you that in order to worship, you needed to have these certain clean animals. And guess which animals were the only clean animals in the whole area? The ones that were already inside the temple that they owned. So you had to exchange the money, and then you had to use the money that they gave you to buy the overpriced animals that they were selling, all in order to worship God. It's full of corruption, isn't it? And so here we have Jesus, who talks about loving our enemies, and then we drive out the corruption. Isn't that an interesting segue? Is the two to go together? There's another thing that Jesus does. If you look, he seems to make a lot of the Pharisees and Sadducees upset. Do you know why? He would hang out with sinners. He would hang out with tax collectors and prostitutes, people that they didn't like. He would hang out with the Gentiles, the non-church people. And, you know, I've been around this a time or two. Hanging around too many non-church people can make church people very upset. Because Jesus was actually accused of being a drunkard and a glutton. That's scriptural. Didn't know that, did you? Matthew chapter 9, verse 11, Jesus is accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And so here he is This same one who is saying, don't keep score of the tit for tat of everything that's wrong, but he's going in and he's actually rustling some major feathers. Very unmarshmallow-like behavior. In fact, it would see Jesus causing some problems with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Another thing that Jesus did that really, really got him in trouble. When I think of being the ultimate marshmallow, it is the nicest person in the world. The person who never upsets anybody. The person who always has something good to say. The person who never makes a wave. Jesus made another major wave when he decided to heal on the Sabbath. And so everything that he's doing, he is teaching with authority. He is hanging out with people that he shouldn't hang out with. He is healing people when he shouldn't heal them. And if you notice, the issue wasn't that he healed them. The issue is the day that he does it on. And it makes all of these waves, and the Pharisees get really, really angry with him. And as I look at this, and in the midst of confronting corruption, in the midst of fighting against an unjust system, he offers compassion and relationship to those who have been hurting. So when we look at this behavior, it's not about Jesus, really, is it? I mean, it is, but it isn't. It's not about him writing things for himself. It's about him doing things that are right in the world for everybody. And I began to look at the apostles, the disciples. What did they do after Jesus ascended into heaven? How did they live? If you read through the book of Acts, we find all of these great stories that the apostles went through. That the things that they did, and it starts out in Acts chapter 2 with the Spirit descending and with people hearing in their own tongue and just the amazing things happen, and the church growing every single day, the church living in community and sharing and taking care of needs. And wouldn't that be a great place to draw away from? You know, just to kind of hide away from all the problems in the world. Except that's not what they do. The church begins to send missionaries out, and they begin to share the gospel, to spread, and to help people understand what Christ has done. And it gets them in trouble, doesn't it? In fact, we know of Paul and Silas being in prison, and as they are in prison, they sing hymns, and the walls begin to crumble. What amazes me is that story after story of the disciples, story after story of the apostles, they don't keep track of all the wrongs that they suffer. In fact, they continue to go out and to share the good news at any expense to themselves. And what blew me away as I was looking at this was Acts chapter 5. We read the apostles are being persecuted. We read that they are ordered not to teach, not to preach, not to share anything about the gospel. They do it anyway. They are flogged. They're told not to preach. They do it again. And then they pray for something that not one person I know would probably pray for. Boldness to go out and do it again. This idea that Christians are nice, quiet people who follow the rules, who never get into trouble, who never do anything that would upset anybody, is not really true. Now, it's not about doing it for ourselves. It's not about being rebels without a cause or just getting into trouble because we want to. It's doing it to advance the kingdom. It's doing it to fight corruption. It's doing it to share the gospel with people. So if you want to look at this, are we to be a marshmallow so that we have an easy life? No. Or do we actually go out and to live and to do something that takes courage? Absolutely. Paul actually writes to Timothy, and Timothy is a young minister who's training, who's growing, and Paul writes and sends him this amazing 2 letters to help him try and grow and understand. And in 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, Paul writes to Timothy, Timothy, you need to remember, with everything that you're going to go through, with everything that happens, that God didn't give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. And as I think about that cowardice, as I think about that being timid, I'm reminded that there really is no place for us to be marshmallows in the world. How does this relate to what's going on today? Think about that. If we were to set everything aside, and I know that it seems like I've been a bit all over the place today, and I have, and I apologize for that as I go through this. But this whole idea of just being nice, of being quiet, of flying under the radar, is not really what the church was about. It's not what happened as the church was founded. It's not the way that Christ lived. How do we put this into practice today? One of the things that has been on the news so prevalent is all of the children who've come in from Mexico. Now, that doesn't really affect us here in Pennsylvania, does it?
Yeah.
It does. We're not on the front lines, but it does. What should be the church's response here? And I want you to think about that. What are the injustices that we see right in our local community? What are the problems that we see right here? What's the corruption that you might encounter around you? See, as Christians, we're not called to keep score of all the wrongs that we go through. But we definitely are supposed to pay attention to the corruption and injustice in the world. I believe that's what Christ did. That's what the apostles did. And it's okay to make waves and be a Christ follower.
Amen.
Does that even make sense?
Yeah.
That it's okay to make waves, especially in this aspect of social justice, especially in this aspect of reaching out and putting an end to corruption, exposing corruption. You can make waves and still be a Christian. The challenge is whether or not we're willing to do it. Because it's a difficult road. It's a road that could lead to actual persecution. And when I think about persecution, sometimes we consider persecution in the American church as somebody not wanting to hear about Jesus. That's not really persecution. If you look at the persecution that happens around the world, Christians being put to death, tortured, falsely imprisoned, that is real persecution. What it could lead to is people really being upset. It could lead to challenges with those who are in the corrupted positions. And it could cost us something. We might have to actually invest and to give of ourselves. I want you to think about it today because the challenge, the real point of it is, did God call us to be marshmallow? It isn't if God called us to be marshmallow Christians. We're not supposed to be marshmallow Christians. I can promise you that. The question is, how do we not be a marshmallow Christian and live in an effective way to help those around us? One of the ways that I love is that we are active in our community, that we try and help, we try and serve, we try and connect. And I'm encouraging you to find more ways to do that on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, monthly basis. And a little plug for one of the ones that we have coming up here in September. September 6th is our tentative day to serve the city. You know, we have talked about how a couple weeks ago, we actually talked about this ordinance that went to the city council, basically saying you do not have to hire anybody that is gay or lesbian. And we talked about the fact that as a congregation, we can't support that, because if we're going to support that, we're done saying love your neighbor, right? If you're going to say it's okay to discriminate in one aspect, you can't turn around and say it's okay to love in the next. They need to match. And I was a little scared as I shared that, because that's not necessarily the popular track in some churches around the area. It's much easier to jump on and say, you know what, it's okay to hate a group of people. And it's not okay. I don't believe that's the model that Christ gave us. It's not the model that the apostles lived. And it's not the model that we should be taking here. And so I'm encouraging you to do something really daring this week. I'm going to encourage you to pray for boldness. Pray for boldness in ways to live this out. Pray for boldness in ways to carry this out and to not take the easy road of squishing down and giving in to whatever you might see that's wrong. What do you think? Let's stop there for today. And I will tell you that these topical sermons just kill me. There's so much you can do. There's so much you can share. I love it when I take a little passage and expand. We try to take all of this and put it together. So if you want to look at how the apostles really lived, if you want to see what Jesus did, go back, read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Look at the way Jesus lived. The way he lived is the reason he was crucified. Nothing marshmallow about him. The reason that the church spread the way it did was because what the apostles did is they lived this out in Acts. And they prayed for boldness, and they moved forward boldly every single day. And it encourages me to do the same. So let's pray. Dear God, we just thank you for this time together today, God. As we talk about this idea of being a marshmallow Christian, it's just such a ludicrous idea. Because, God, we are not supposed to just be nice and kind and sweet and play it safe and not make any waves. But, God, we're also not supposed to do this stuff for ourselves. We're supposed to do it for you. God, we pray for boldness as the apostles did, as the young church did. Not so that we can be great, not so that we can have it all together, but, God, so that you can be glorified through everything. God, open our eyes to injustice. Open our eyes to corruption. Help us to see those who are shoved to the margins and help us to love them as best we can. God, give us courage and give us boldness in your name. Amen.
Amen.